Of all the financial titans and philanthropists of the 20th century, none are more complex or mysterious than George Soros.
Last 2 years you've been blamed for financial collapse in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding.
The Prime Minister of Malaysia
Yes.
said that the region spent 40 years trying to build up its economy, and along comes a moron like Soros with a lot of money, and it's all over. He called you a criminal.
It's easier for him to blame an outside force than to admit that they were mismanaging their economy and their currency. The French finance minister talked about hanging speculators from lampposts.
George Soros and his signature shock therapy reforms that would rock Russia's economy were generally in line with that of Russia's first vice premier and minister of economics, Yegor Gaidar, known as its architect. Gaidar is largely responsible for Russia's hyperinflation of the 1990s. He is also responsible for appointing engineer Boris Saltykov as science minister, who accepted the $100 million from Soros for the International Science Foundation. Gaidar's lineage offers a wider perspective to his views. Son of Timur Gaidar, Soviet Rear Admiral, journalist, and personal friend of Cuban General Raul Castro, and model for the character of the same name in the book Timur and His Squad, a story about young boys who assist families of the Red Army. The book's author, Timur's father, Yegor's grandfather, Arkady Gaidar, Soviet writer and Red Army commander who came up as a Bolshevik and inspired the Timurite movement, a communist youth movement like the Little Octoberists and Vladimir Lenin's Young Pioneers, a compulsory program for children aged 9 through 14. Yegor's maternal grandfather, also a writer, Russian Bolshevik Pavel Bajov, author of The Malachite Box and various books on the Russian Revolution. Yegor married the daughter of yet another author, Jewish science fiction writer Arkady Strugatsky, who along with brother Boris authored numerous science fiction works, many of them taking place in the 22nd century, known as the World of Noon, or Wanderer's Universe, a depiction of advanced technology and communism, an anarchistic meritocracy governed by a world council comprised of scientists, a world Soros and company likely envision for themselves. The Wanderers are believed to be beings that are manipulating other beings in the Noon universe for their own purposes. Maria Gaidar is a Ukrainian politician and former deputy PM of the Russian Kirov Oblast and advisor to the President of Ukraine. She is founder of the Social Youth Movement, Democratic Alternative, and the Other Russia Coalition, which featured chess champion Garry Kasparov, Bolshevik Party leader Edward Limonov, and the radical socialist vanguard of Red Youth. Maria is a fierce opponent of Vladimir Putin and has depicted him as the Antichrist, leading the world to a nuclear apocalypse. Father Yegor survived a poisoning attempt in 2006. Many suspected that the man behind it was Boris Berezovsky. Maria is descendant of still another author, Mikhail Lermontov, Russian poet and writer, often referred to as Poet of the Caucasus. Maria is a descendant of the Russian aristocratic Salkova family. It's unknown if the same family is relation to Russian noblewoman and Hungarian blood countess Daria Saltykova, notorious for her brutal torturing and killing of serfs, or if the name is shared with Yegor Gaida, appointed science minister Boris Saltykov. In Hungary, George Soros' Open Society received donations from another prolific family, the Blinkens, in particular Donald and Vera Blinken. So much so that the Open Society archives are named the Vera and Donald Blinken Archives. Donald Blinken was an investment banker and U.S. ambassador to Hungary, son of Ukrainian Jews from Kiev, and grandson of another author, Meyer Blinken, one of the first Yiddish authors in America to write about sexuality. His early works were published in the Yiddish satire publication, Der Kibitzer. He was educated at the Talmud Torah Religious Elementary School. Later essays saw publication in socialist periodicals Der Jiddische Arbeiterwelt, or Jewish Labor World, and in 1808, Blinken wrote Weber, a collection of poetry and short stories dealing with infidelity, abortion, and sexual desire. The name Blinken suggests that the family emigrated from the village of Blinky in Nevel County, now part of Belarus. This area was known for the Hasidic centers of learning and important to the Chabad movement. Grandson Donald became co-founder of the investment bank Warburg Pincus, which specialized in venture capital investing, one of the firms mentioned in the Panama Papers, or Pandora Papers, a series of leaked documents detailing attorney-client information for more than 200,000 offshore entities created by the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca. These papers helped establish a prosecution case for Wirecard payment processing CEO Jan Marsalek, a suspected spy for the Soviet Union, involved in a series of accounting malpractices. In 1956, Blinken met Latvian Jewish painter Mark Rothko and became an art collector and president of the Mark Rothko Foundation. He also sat on the board of the American Jewish Committee. In 1994, President Bill Clinton appointed him as U.S. ambassador to Hungary, in addition to becoming the Secretary General of the World Federation of the United Nations Associations. He had two brothers, Robert and Alan, the latter who became U.S. ambassador to Belgium. Alan served as managing director of Wertheim, Schroeder & Company investment firm and Belgian biopharmaceutical manufacturer UCB. He is married to Melinda Blinken, daughter of Jewish Hollywood producer Howard Koch. Donald Blinken's son is the current Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. Anthony is the former Deputy National Security Advisor to former President Barack Obama and worked in the State Department during the Clinton administration. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and partner of private equity firm Pine Island Capital Partners, part of West Exec Advisors, whose extensive client list includes investment juggernaut Blackstone, Bank of America, Facebook, Uber, Palantir Tech. West Exec also works with Google's Jigsaw LLC, a tech business incubator that provides capital to tech startups, much like Soros has for Russian scientists. Until 2022, Jigsaw was run by Jewish-American businessman Jared Cohen, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, former advisor to Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton, as well as a specialist in counterterrorism. Jigsaw's original mission was countering extremism and online censorship by applying technological solutions. In 2018, Jigsaw conducted a Russian troll bot campaign on the internet, supposedly to show how easily disinformation campaigns can be spread. But it also opened up the problematic idea of how these programs and others like it, like the redirect method, can be used without the approval of the public. Another curious client of Blinken's West Exec partners is the Israeli artificial intelligence firm Windward, specializing in shipping analytics and risk management. Platform users include BP, Shell, HSBC, and the Israel Aerospace Industries Limited. Blinken has received millions in compensation from West Exec, which continues to partner Silicon Valley firms with the Department of Defense. He is one of the men responsible for sending billions of dollars to Israel to keep their Iron Dome operation running. Blinken was involved in the handover of Crimea in 2014 to Vladimir Putin. He was heavily involved in surrendering Afghanistan to the Taliban and is at the forefront in the international debacle happening in Ukraine, authorizing supply of weapons to Ukraine in support of their opposition to Russia.
Well, you know my preoccupation with history because it's the guide for the future for us. Tonight we're going to explore a more recent piece of our history which has been unpleasant for most of us in one way or another. And for many people here in South Florida, the Holocaust has had direct impact. It's the point of departure for our discussion tonight of this book by Samuel Pizarro called Of Blood and Hope.
And the reason I wrote this book in the United States, not in Europe, where it became a massive bestseller, I wrote it on Cape Cod largely, in Massachusetts, because I wanted to be away from the bloody history of Europe while writing it, relate it to the United States, make Americans who have never suffered a disruptive war on their soil, who have never been overtaken by tyrants, to understand that this does relate to their lives, to their fears, and to their hopes for the future.
Anthony Blinken's stepfather is Jewish-American lawyer Samuel Pizarro, another former employee of the United Nations. He served on the Economic Task Force for John F. Kennedy and claimed to have been a survivor of the Holocaust. Pizarro is from Białystok, Poland, a former part of the Russian Empire. As a boy, Pizarro joined the youth division of the Soviet Communist Party. After the war, Pizarro moved to Australia and was later admitted to Harvard, where he received his PhD in law. There he met Henry Kissinger and the Polish-American political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski, organizer of the Trilateral Commission, whose father, Tadeusz, member of the CFR and Bilderberg Group, assisted Jews migrating from Germany during the Second World War. Zbigniew is father of MSNBC anchor Mika Brzezinski, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under George Bush, Ian Brzezinski, and Mark Brzezinski, U.S. Ambassador to Poland and former ambassador to Sweden under Barack Obama. Pizarro became a diplomat, an international proponent of globalization, and international lawyer for French Jewish hotel tycoon Sir James Goldsmith, Armand Hammer, and Robert Maxwell. In fact, Pizarro was the last person to have spoken to Maxwell, a longtime friend, before he fell from his yacht to his death in November 1991. His body found off the coast of the Canary Islands, near his yacht, Lady Jilin, originally built for Ahmad Khashoggi. His death was ruled a heart attack, along with accidental drowning. Maxwell was buried at the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem in an extravagant funeral attended by a number of former heads of state and Israeli intelligence, including friend Samuel Pizarro. Some believe that Maxwell faked his death, proposing that perhaps in exchange for safe passage, handsome shares of Maxwell's Daily Mirror. But many involved with the intelligence services believe that his death was part of a bigger cover-up of massive amounts of capital leaving the Communist Party for the West. In the documentary Man Overboard from Tell Deutsche Rundfunk, a series of interviews with former KGB and GRU officials reveals that many saw Maxwell as a version of Henry Kissinger. From former KGB Colonel Stanislav Sorokin.
I would say that he was used by higher-ups, just as the Americans used Kissinger as a messenger or ambassador. Maxwell left England and brought with him a message from Thatcher, an unofficial one. He left Gorbachev to go to America and tried to bring with him a message from Gorbachev.
Like Maxwell, Sorokin used publishing and copyright as a cover for other various activities. In 1973, the Soviet Union became a signatory to the Universal Copyright Convention, or UCC. But certain firms entered into exclusive translation rights contracts with the Soviet Copyright Office, or VAAP. The VAAP grew to become a monopoly until its abolition in 1989. The Copyright Agency also appeared to be a vehicle for capital flight outside of Russia and to approve translations for publications sold outside of the country. Former GRU Colonel Yevgeny Solovyov, who worked under the cover of the VAAP agency, said of Maxwell's death,
I think that was probably a so-called murder on order. It was all professionally done and was covered up as a suicide.
The importance of publishing in regard to movement of money, and perhaps even more important, the control of information and spreading of misinformation, cannot be overstated. The VAAP was a crucial element to KGB operations, and Maxwell, a key figure in the publishing world, knew this all too well. From 1973 to 1982, the VAAP was in the hands of Soviet diplomat Boris Pankin, the Soviet Union's longest-serving Swedish diplomat. Pankin resisted the 1991 coup attempt by the Soviet Union's hardline Communist Party to overthrow then-President Mikhail Gorbachev. These hardliners were made up of KGB agents who detained Gorbachev but were unable to detain newly elected President Boris Yeltsin. The failed coup led to the fall of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union itself would dissolve only a few months later. For a brief period, Gorbachev called Pankin to serve as foreign minister. During this 82-day period, Pankin established diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, purged the foreign ministry of its KGB agents, and began the U.S.-Soviet disarmament process. Pankin was ambassador to Sweden at the time of the assassination of Olof Palme, popular Swedish statesman and leader of the Social Democratic Party. A critic of Soviet and American policy, Palme was killed on February 28, 1986, by gunshot, in a case that would lead back to the Soviets and the State of Israel. The assassin was never found. An international investigation lingered for years, involving multiple suspects. It appeared that the Swedish government had covered up important aspects of the investigation. At first, local Christer Peterson was convicted of the murder, but his conviction was soon overturned. Another suspect, Victor Gunnarsson, was taken in for questioning, released, and brought back a few days later, and released again. As a member of the European Workers' Party, Gunnarsson was vilified in the media, and much of the blame was put upon the movement's leader, Lyndon LaRouche, American political activist and perennial presidential candidate, and at the time, only declared candidate for the Democratic Party presidential nomination in 1988. LaRouche was regarded in the media as a conspiracy theorist, claiming that he was a target for assassination by Queen Elizabeth, the Zionist mafia, and that he and associates had been drugged and brainwashed by the CIA and MI6. Leading the charge against the character of LaRouche and the suspicion of his associates and his involvement of Palme's murder, Jewish American socialist and fact-finding director of the ADL, Erwin Sewell, as well as former KGB agent and VAAP head, Boris Pankin. The ADL and the KGB appeared to be involved in a disinformation campaign surrounding the case, and defaming Gunnarsson, LaRouche, and anyone connected was top priority. The ADL had already been implicated in the 1985 case of John Walker, convicted of spying for the Soviet Union and sentenced to life in prison. The ADL had Walker on the payroll, according to court evidence. Walker had infiltrated the KKK and later the National Democratic Policy Committee, founded by LaRouche. LaRouche had been infiltrated by another Jewish subversive, activist and founder of the Jewish Defense Organization, Mordecai Levy. This was discovered when Levy was found to have been jury tampering in a federal civil case. Levy had been involved in the 1981 firebombing of a Nigerian diplomat's car at a Soviet UN mission, and later charged with attempted murder of JDL leader Irv Rubin, a man who would be suspected of running a protection racket against LA rappers Tupac Shakur and Eazy-E. According to journalist Robert I. Friedman, who published a lengthy dossier on the JDL, the New York area JDL was heavily influenced by the Soviet KGB, in particular Brighton Beach. This cell was responsible for the murder of CIA operative Skerim Soobzakov, thanks to information from Mordecai Levy. The same JDL-KGB relationship surfaced during the 1984 Temple Mount plot, when 27 members of a Jewish underground group attempted to destroy the Dome of the Rock in an effort to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. This action was funded by a small group of Syrian Jewish families, one of them the prolific family of Edmund Safra. Later that same year, Erwin Sewell and the ADL were implicated in the assassination on Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. The 1980 Gunnarsson arrest provided reason for the international media to paint the European Labour Party as a criminal organization and frame its leader, Lyndon LaRouche, as a violent lunatic fringe candidate. He was deemed a far-right anti-Semite, even though his ideas were originally Marxist. Gunnarsson had been released, but the media kept on with stories related to the now old charges, and LaRouche would be defamed in the media for years to come.
The lack of evidence against the EAP would have been made up for by the journalists, who would not have hesitated to find the proofs.
It's likely that Olof Palme was murdered because of his knowledge of the weapons trafficking between Sweden and Iran, and his willingness to investigate. Former President of Iran, Abu Hassan Bani Sadr.
I know this from two different and credible sources. Palme was killed as the direct consequence of what he knew about Sweden-Iran arms trafficking.
This theory aligns with the multinational Arms for Hostages effort spearheaded by Oliver North under President George Bush, but the CIA and the media were after LaRouche. He was imprisoned for tax evasion under the Bush administration. Ex-Stasi officer Colonel Herbert Bremer.
The backroom decision was made to cause anonymous telephone calls to be made to Swedish papers and finally directed to the police. And it happened in the week following the Palme crime. Our telephoners said they knew the EAP had committed murder and even that they had seen an unusual agitation in the EAP offices in Stockholm the night before the crime. There was no truth in it, but it sounded credible and well-informed.
Soon after, Swedish paper Extrabladet, Berlin's Tageszeitung, and the Berliner Extradienst announced that Swedish police were investigating extreme right-wing groups. Soviet ambassador to Sweden and former head of the Copyright Office, Boris Pankin, would later be sitting at the top of the KGB. ADL fact finder Erwin Sewell traveled to Sweden in 1986 to denounce LaRouche and the EAP, calling him a small-time Hitler, prompting LaRouche to sue for defamation, unsuccessfully. LaRouche organized a group to combat the ADL, called the Provisional Committee to Clean Up B'nai B'rith, the Freemasonic group precursor to the ADL. He often referred to sinister plans and conspiracies emanating from the Jews, in particular, Russian communists and New Age Aquarians. This conspiracy traced men like Henry Kissinger and Walter Mondale back to the days of ancient Babylon. He and his associates were denounced as neo-Nazis.
Mondale is not simply a KGB agent in the ordinary sense, of course. Mondale is jointly owned by the left wing of the Socialist International and the grain cartel interests. If both these owners tell Mondale to lick the floor before a nationwide TV audience, I sincerely believe he would do just that.
Watch Lyndon LaRouche, Independent Democrat for President, Tuesday, October 23rd.
His second wife, German Helga Zepp LaRouche, authored the 1984 The Hitler Book and founded the Schiller Institute think tank, which argued for the abolition of the World Trade Organization. In 2015, Zepp LaRouche wrote an article calling climate change a satanic swindle and that the intention was to eliminate 6 billion human beings. The Schiller Institute, like LaRouche, was met with claims of anti-Semitism. During the breakout of AIDS in the 1980s, LaRouche once again questioned the establishment narrative and called AIDS a communicable disease. Some of his ideas came from British venereologist John Seale, who believed that HIV may have been created in a germ warfare laboratory by gene editing process and was released deliberately, similar to the Visna virus. This theory was backed by Russian Jewish biology professor Jacob Siegel, later revealed to be a Soviet KGB agent working on Operation Infection, an information or disinformation campaign, depending on who you ask. It claims that the U.S. had invented the AIDS virus as part of a project at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Ironic, seeing that at the time, Soviet scientists were looking for American help with their own AIDS problem in the Soviet Union. The U.S. refused help until the campaign ceased. In 1992, Ukrainian Jewish diplomat and director of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, Yevgeny Primakov, stated that the KGB was behind the claims that AIDS was an American development. LaRouche and company created the Biological Strategic Defense Initiative in direct opposition to the World Health Organization and Centers for Disease Control, and accused them of attempting euthanasia and genocide. October 1986. LaRouche's offices are raided by federal officers in Virginia and Massachusetts. LaRouche and 12 others were indicted on charges of credit card fraud and obstruction of justice. The very next year, LaRouche's Fusion Energy Foundation was overtaken through bankruptcy. The foundation advocated for the building of nuclear power plants and repeatedly met with the Director of Defense Programs for the National Security Council. LaRouche movement member Ray Pollock helped create the Strategic Defense Initiative, which became the groundwork for the Reagan Star Wars program. It was the development of this very program that LaRouche believed was the basis for the raid on his offices.
The Soviet government hated me for it. Gorbachev also hated my guts and called for my assassination and so forth.
Lyndon LaRouche was jailed in 1989, but later ran for Congress in 1990 and for president in 1992. His running mate, civil rights activist and minister James Bevel. Bevel had worked with LaRouche, pursuing allegations of a child sex trafficking ring in Omaha, Nebraska, involving Lawrence E. King Jr., who ran the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. Several alleged victims claim that King ran an underground club in which children as young as 8 years old were forced to have sex with businessmen, media celebrities, and moguls, and high-ranking politicians. According to the alleged victims, the government was forcing their silence by threatening and intimidation.
John DeCamp is among the most highly decorated Vietnam veterans. A former Republican state senator in Lincoln, Nebraska, he is now a lawyer fighting the legacy of Lawrence King's abuse of power.
It's a web of intrigue that starts at our Holy of Holies, Boys Town, Nebraska, one of the most respected institutions in the United States, and spreads out like a spider web to Washington, D.C., right up to the steps of the nation's capital, the steps of the White House, involves some of the most respected and powerful and richest businessmen in this United States of America. And the centerpiece of the entire web is the use of children for sex and drug dealing and drug couriers, the compromising of politicians, the compromising of businessmen, but worst of all, the corruption of key institutions of government that have the duty and responsibility to make sure these things never happen.
The allegations were that much of the abuse was related to an elite cult that practiced devil worship, cannibalism, drug dealing, and human trafficking and arms dealing for the CIA. Boy prostitutes were given tours of the White House. One of the main suspects, Lawrence King, was in prison for bank fraud. The other, Republican lobbyist Craig Spence, committed suicide. He was a socialite who threw parties for people like CIA operative James Lilly, Joe DeGeneva, the man who prosecuted Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard, former Attorney General John Mitchell, convicted in the Watergate scandal, and Jewish-American lawyer Roy Cohn, who played a large role in the prosecution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, as well as the rise of President Donald Trump. Spence was named as a customer in a homosexual escort ring that was raided and under investigation by the Secret Service, led by a man named Henry Vinson, a funeral director who was laundering money and providing services for key officials of the Reagan and Bush administrations. Spence claimed that the CIA set up surveillance equipment in his home, all very similar to the situation involving Jeffrey Epstein. Several Republicans and Democrats saw jail time. In 1994, the investigative documentary Conspiracy of Silence, which was set to air on Discovery Channel, was pulled, and the money to make it was reimbursed to Yorkshire Television.
On July the 11th, 1990, Gary Caradori and his 8-year-old son AJ were flying home from Chicago in his light aircraft. They had watched the All-Star baseball game, and Caradori had been pursuing new leads.
Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are in Harold Cameron's cornfield trying to determine what caused this private plane to crash, killing its 2 occupants.
The bodies of Gary Caradori and 8-year-old AJ were found in the wreckage.
National Transportation Safety Board investigators say wreckage from the crash is apparently strewn over a 3/4 to 1 mile long stretch in this field.
The fact that the wreckage is scattered over a large area certainly demonstrates that it did break up in flight. The exact mechanism of breakup yet is still unknown.
The federal investigation was never able to discover what tore the plane apart.
There are things missing from the plane. His briefcase is missing. I think the plane was sabotaged. There's no doubt in my mind.
Within 24 hours of the tragedy, all Caradori's records were impounded by the FBI.
Despite numerous credible allegations, the Omaha police refused to prosecute. And within 24 hours of Caradori's mysterious plane crash, FBI agents impounded all records of the investigation. Boys Town started off as a home for orphans after World War I, but grew to have cash reserves up to $500 million, a staggering amount for such an operation. Although it was started in Boys Town, Nebraska by Irish-born Catholic priest Father Edward J. Flanagan, the funding largely came from a familiar source, namely Henry Monsky, president of Jewish Masonic group B'nai B'rith. Monsky was president of the Omaha Chamber of Commerce, the Omaha Welfare Fund, and the Omaha Council of Boy Scouts. He was also a member of Jewish organizations like the Jewish Zionist Youth Fraternity, Zeta Beta Tau, the Freemasons, and the Elks Lodge. His second wife, Daisy Hirsch, was the widow of Albert Rothschild and niece of Jewish-American lawyer Adolf Krauss, former president of the long-embattled Chicago Board of Education and founding member of law firm Krauss & Meyer, which later became Meyer Brown. There were plenty of reasons why people seemed out to get Lyndon LaRouche. His knowledge of U.S.-Soviet coordination, his knowledge of the Iran-Contra affair, his global sphere of influence, political savvy, and understanding of finance. But much of the Get LaRouche propaganda began just weeks after his Strategic Defense Initiative proposal was adopted by the Reagan administration, his focus on Star Wars, similar to the emphasis put on the Space Force program years later by President Donald Trump, and likely for good reasons. LaRouche's ideas were being embraced worldwide. Members of the LaRouche movement were finding their way into public office, and with this movement came a crop of new thinkers, idealists, critical of big government, and perhaps more importantly, the elite oligarchy.
It is. The IDF, which is part of its war aims, has carried out an aggressive espionage and covert operations penetration of the USA, including the recruitment of American-born assets. It is so far unknown, but strongly suspected, that some of these Israeli assets may have contributed an included feature of the rogue networks whose complicity abetted the successful attacks of September 11. The B'nai B'rith is the most evil and most dangerous of the social action programs associated with religious beliefs in the United States today. Literally thousands of operatives for the Zionist lobby have penetrated the halls of Congress, the state and defense departments, the CIA, and American business and labor organizations to gather information, which is then transmitted up the chain of command to Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and the Maltese Order. These agents gathering information and intelligence on U.S. national security policy, corporate policy, and financial policy for transmission to the enemy. Their loyalties lie not with the United States, but with the Zionist British organism. The Zionist octopus must be eliminated.
It was B'nai B'rith that led the charge for much of the Get LaRouche task force. During the Reagan administration, intelligence officials opposed to Reagan initiated a British counterintelligence-style campaign involving multiple agencies in multiple countries. It began with a series of meetings at the home of New York investment banker John Train, co-founder and first managing editor of the quarterly magazine The Paris Review, first published by former United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and Phi Beta Kappa member Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, who also happened to be Train's college roommate at Harvard. These meetings launched an international defamation campaign involving an avalanche of articles and broadcast reports. The October 1986 raid on the LaRouche headquarters involved over 400 armed law enforcement officers tanks, helicopters, and aircraft in what appeared to be a provocation of violence by the federal government, and at the very least, a purposeful and very public spectacle. John Train represented the very oligarchy that LaRouche was up against. Train's family had profited from their shipping firm of Enoch Train and Company, junior partner of the British East India Company during the opium trade. Train's grandfather, Charles Henry Goster, was a founding member of J.P. Morgan and considered among the 4 or 5 organizing minds of Wall Street. Great-uncle George Francis Train was founder of Credit Mobilier and involved in the formation of the Union Pacific Railroad. He also financed the newspaper The Revolution, dedicated to women's rights, and published by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He was believed to be the inspiration for the character of Phileas Fogg, the protagonist of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, after having traveled the world himself. John Train married Maria Teresa Seniti Pianzana, a supporter of the Black Prince, Valerio Borghese, Italian Navy commander and neo-fascist politician who took part in a coup known as the Golpe Borghese, which attempted to kidnap Italian President Giuseppe Saragat. Train advocated for a European monarchy system developed by Cyril Northcote Parkinson. Parkinson collaborated with Dutch beer maker Alfred Heineken to create a plan for a United States of Europe, known as Eurotopia, which would split Europe into 75 mini-states, each led by a house of a monarchy. He had similar plans for the U.S. during the late 80s and height of the Get LaRouche movement. Train developed the Northcote Parkinson Fund, a tax-exempt fund now known as the Train Foundation, which awards the Civil Courage Prize, inspired by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Serving as treasurer of the fund, Jewish-American journalist Midge Decter, wife of Jewish-American writer and neoconservative Norman Podhoretz.
Free thinkers of the world, don't look now, but there's a new addition to the iPod Signature series from Rise Attire. Your based, evil-free ambassadors. iPod's POP series is 6 chapters deep, so it's time to commemorate with a brand new design. Printed direct to garment on the highest quality cotton tees and hoodies. Untouched by the hands of Chinese slave labor. Get pursuity and intrude the signal with Rise Attire and iPod, the weapon of choice for a new generation of the info war. In a world saturated with lies, don't just watch. Rise. RiseAttireUSA.com.
Well, if you're wondering what's happened, so am I.
They had 2 children. Daughter, American-Israeli journalist Ruthie Bloom, married to Israeli Broadcasting Authority Editor-in-Chief Steve Leibovitz, and son John Podhoretz, columnist for the New York Post, married to Isla Ray Cohen, producer for Saturday Night Live, and employee of International Creative Management. Decter is mother-in-law to Elliot Abrams, Jewish-American lawyer who served as foreign policy advisor for the Reagan, Bush, and Trump administration. Abrams is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and was involved in the Iran-Contra affair, giving false testimony to Congress about his knowledge of the affair. Abrams was pardoned by President George H.W. Bush and appointed by President George W. Bush to the Office of Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Operations at the National Security Council. He is a longtime vocal supporter of the State of Israel. Train's foundation receives annual donations from another curious consulting company known as ISI Enterprises, run by Michael and Barbara Ledeen, Jewish-American historians and political analysts. Michael was also involved in the Iran-Contra affair as a consultant to National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, meeting with Israeli officials and the CIA to arrange meetings with Iranian officials who would be given weapons by Israel and negotiate with Hezbollah for release of hostages in Lebanon. Wife Barbara was a staffer for Senator Chuck Grassley and launched an investigation in 2015 to investigate Hillary Clinton's emails. Both are close allies of General Michael Flynn. Both were involved in Flynn's testimony about the efforts to obtain Clinton's emails. Michael Ledeen is a promoter of universal fascism. The Train Foundation has involved itself in numerous international destabilization efforts, along with the International Rescue Committee and Freedom House. Both projects involve Jewish American economist Leo Chern, former CIA chief James Jesus Angleton, Jewish American activist Jay Lovestone, who served as leader for the Communist Party USA, and later as an anti-communist and CIA aide, as well as Jewish American investment banker Felix Rohatyn. John Train sits on the board of the Paul Klebnikov Fund, created for Train's son-in-law, Paul Klebnikov, Moscow editor for Forbes magazine. He recently published a book exposing Russian mobster Boris Berezovsky. Also on that board, Yeltsin-era oligarch Boris Jordan, CEO of the Sputnik Group, once CEO of Gazprom Media, and board member of Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska's EM Plus Group, one of the world's largest producers of aluminum. Train's fingerprints were on the Afghan Relief Committee, another arm of a sprawling private intelligence apparatus during the Reagan era that backed Mujahideen kingpin Gulbuddin Hekmatyar.
تاسو دغه د تیر 2 ورځو عملیاتو نه مقصد څه و؟ تیر 2 ورځې کې تاسو عملیات وکړل.
زموږ عملیات هر وخت موافقانه نه وي. ځکه چې موږ نظامي مواد پوره نه لرو. د دې لپاره چې دښمن هر وخت زړور نه شي، بعضې وخت په دوی موږ فشار اچوو او مجاهدین ته دغه دلوري وربخو چې دوی هغه نه شي، د دښمن تر تاثیر لاندې رو نه شي. د دې لپاره موږ عملیات په دښمن باندې په دغه شکل
روسا از نقطه نظر اسلحه با گذشت هر سال سلاح خود تغییر داده رفتند. در اوایل وقتی که داخل افغانستان شدند سلاح بسیار سنگین با خود آورده بودند که در جنگ‌های چریکی و مناطق کوهستانی چندان به دردخور نبود، مگر بعدتر استفاده از هلیکوپترها و سلاح سبکتر بیشتر ساختند و فعلا با گذشت هر سال در سلاح خود یک نوآوری میکنند و سلاح بهترتر داخل افغانستان میکنند. تکتیک روس هم با گذشت هر سال از نظر ما بهترتر شده رفته و نسبت به گذشته روسا فعلا متحرکتر هستند، مگر از نقطه نظر روسیه روحیه برخلاف تا جایی که من تجربه دارم با گذشت هر سال، چون روس‌ها در افغانستان خیلی اساکرش تلفات داده، روحیه اساکر روسی پایین آمده رفته و فعلا خصوصا در جنگ آخری که ما دیدیم، این که فقط 1-2 ماه پیشتر جنگ دوام گذشت، اساکر روسی چندان مورال و روحیه نداشتند.
With the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union came a resistance campaign under the Carter and later Reagan administration, which would fund and train Afghan holy warriors or mujahideen. Think tanks, private agencies, and other interests rallied to get in on the fight against the Soviets. These agencies acted under direction of British intelligence, who lobbied Congress and even arranged military training for these resistance fighters. Many of the members of these organizations were the very same involved in the Iran-Contra networks of Oliver North under Vice President George Bush. In attendance at Train's 3 Get LaRouche meetings held at his home, right-wing journalist John Reese. Reese emigrated to the U.S. from Great Britain in 1963 after being fired from Robert Maxwell's London Daily Mirror. It was discovered that he had obtained unethical gratuities from restaurants and hotels in London. He moved to Newark and started New Careers, a program designed for providing jobs to black residents. It was later discovered that Reese had been overcharging the city for his services. Reese went on to Chicago, where he would work as an undercover informant, targeting groups that opposed the war in Vietnam. He would continue selling information and later political disinformation to the FBI as a columnist for the Washington Times. Reese's Malden Institute, a right-wing national security think tank, receives funding from B'nai B'rith and the Anti-Defamation League by way of oil billionaire Richard Mellon Scaife, who at the time was one of the largest funders of right-wing and neoconservative organizations. Scaife's funding of the Get LaRouche sessions and journalists who wrote LaRouche hit pieces proved pivotal in the prosecution and jailing of LaRouche, the same group that went after Bill and Hillary Clinton in the 1990s. John Reese, Dennis King, counter-spy journalist Russell Bellant, and Chip Berlet one-time Washington bureau chief of High Times magazine, who authored He Wants to Take Your Drugs Away and War on Drugs, The Strange Story of Lyndon LaRouche. Scaife had briefly run the CIA-funded propaganda group known as Forum World Features as head of its parent firm. The publishing arm operated from the National Strategy Information Center in New York. Most operations were overseen by CIA agent and grandson of former President Theodore Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a major role player in the CIA's 1953 efforts to overthrow the democratic government of Iran. Another key member of John Train's Get LaRouche sessions, D.C. fact finder under Irwin Sewell for the ADL, Mira Lansky Boland. She is the granddaughter of Jewish gangster and Zionist arms dealer Meyer Lansky. Her husband, John C. Boland, is a financial investment journalist whose works have appeared in Barron's, The Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. John's close colleague, fund manager Walter Schloss, was treasurer for John Train's think tank Freedom House, a suspected CIA front that was in the middle of the Iran-Contra affair, as a recipient of hundreds of thousands of dollars used to fund domestic propaganda in favor of the Contras. Schloss and Train facilitated funds for Freedom House on behalf of Project Democracy. Jewish American economist and foreign intelligence advisor Leo Chern served as honorary chairman, and as chairman of the world's largest refugee agency and another Train project, the International Rescue Agency. Train, Boland, Schloss, Chern, and Freedom House are all just elements of the National Security Council, created and directed by Walter Raymond Jr., intelligence and media operations official with a specialty in Soviet bloc and Western European affairs. Raymond worked for the CIA and later served on the National Security Council. His name appeared more than any other White House staff member or government employee on Oliver North's calendar during the Iran-Contra scandal, when he told a committee that he had resigned from the CIA so there would be no question of any contamination of this. The very next year, President Reagan launched Project Truth, a propaganda campaign aimed at countering the Soviet messaging. This was now a domestic and international campaign under Project Democracy. Reagan placed Jesuit CIA Director William Casey in charge of the public diplomacy apparatus, and Casey would appoint Walter Raymond, who had already spent 2 decades implementing clandestine media propaganda campaigns overseas in the name of spreading democracy. Raymond's involvement signified the wholesale integration of intelligence and PR at the National Security Council. An entire chapter dedicated to Raymond's and Oliver North's activities was drafted for the Iran-Contra report, but House and Senate Republicans kept it from being included in the final report. Casey and Raymond included Australian media baron Rupert Murdoch in their endeavors, and Director of the U.S. Information Agency Charles Wise set up the meetings between Murdoch and President Reagan. Following the CIA's global operations scandals of the 60s and 70s, the Reagan administration was looking for ways to influence global policy with private funding from political action groups or non-governmental organizations, NGOs, in order to relieve pressure from government intel groups. These activities could range from influencing media coverage, organizing and training militias or activists, and preparing countries for regime change. Declassified memos from 1982 depict the transition between the turbulent CIA scandals and the new formation of secret and permanent institutions, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, created in 1983. Murdoch's meeting with Reagan included lawyers Thomas Boland and partner, Jewish-American prosecutor and fixer Roy Cohn. The meeting took place 5 days after NSC advisor William Clark notified Reagan in a memo that we will develop a scenario for obtaining private funding.
Charlie Wick has offered to take the lead. We may have to call on you to meet with a group of potential donors.
Murdoch appeared to be that source of funding. Another memo from August 9, 1983 shows that Casey had met with ad executives on how to sell Reagan's policies to the public, and Murdoch was mentioned as if he were already involved. Also mentioned, Get LaRouche orchestrator John Train's Freedom House.
We would recommend funding via Freedom House or some other structure that has credibility in the political center. Wick via Murdoch may be able to draw down added funds for this effort.
Another memo from 1984 regarding a private funders project shows Raymond mentioning journalist and CIA asset, as well as director of Richard Mellon Scaife's Forum World Features, Brian Crozier. Like many others, Crozier had a communist past, but was now anti-communist. He had a long history of keeping stories for the CIA, which funded Forum World Features. According to the National Archives, there are other documents related to Murdoch and Wick's USIA that have yet to be unclassified. Murdoch, whose empire had yet to venture outside of Australia, now had a foothold on American expansion and would later purchase stake in 20th Century Fox. He also benefited from a number of eased regulations from the FCC, and a few years later in 1987, with the removal of the Fairness Doctrine requiring networks to broadcast politically balanced opinions, Murdoch's empire would expand even further. A November 4, 1982 memo has Raymond writing to NSC advisor Clark about the Democracy Initiative.
A critical piece of the puzzle is a serious effort to raise private funds to generate momentum. Casey's talk with Scaife and company suggests they would be very willing to cooperate. Suggest that you note White House interest in private support for the Democracy Initiative.
Mr. President, may I also refer you just to the top of the second page of that document. It will reflect, you cannot mention this, but it will reflect for your eyes and ears who the particular individual was at that country. And ask if that further refreshes your recollection.
No, I know this man, of course, very well, and met with him a number of times in his own country. I don't recall, and I don't really know whether such briefings were given to others like the Secretary of State or not who were going to be meeting with these people. I don't recall seeing this, and as I know that my policy was not to involve others in this. I mean, I wanted them involved, but I didn't want to be on record as doing it.
Freedom House led the charge against Nicaragua's Sandinista government, while Casey and Reagan attempted to overthrow them by covertly funding the Contras. The CIA's role would be concealed by White House staff.
Obviously, we here should not get out front in the development of such an organization, nor should we appear to be a sponsor or advocate.
Standard written responses were used when speaking to the press about Raymond or his involvement with the CIA in regard to the public diplomacy program. Raymond was rarely photographed in public, but from behind the curtains of Reagan's White House, he would bring in Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, the NSC member who orchestrated the Iran-Contra affair.
Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, a veteran of the Vietnam War, is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
They were willing to literally put the Constitution at risk because they believed somehow there was a higher order of things, that the ends do in fact are justified by the means.
Looking back, it's stunning how easily the Cold War enticed us into surrendering popular control of government to the national security state. We've turned the war powers of the United States over to where we're never really sure who, or what they're doing, or what it costs, or who is paying for it. An open society cannot survive a secret government.
Jewish American neoconservative and co-founder of the Project for the New American Century, Robert Kagan, and NED President Carl Gershman, a Jewish American civil servant who, like so many others, somehow went from being a socialist to a neoconservative. Gershman, during the time of the Reagan administration, was serving as ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council. These 1982 memos describe discussion about funding for the Asia Foundation and the need to keep the government's role in it a secret. The Asia Foundation is an international nonprofit organization focused on cultural and educational activities in Asia on behalf of the United States. but for decades, it seems to have operated as much more.
The Asia Foundation is the principal CIA front and funding conduit in Asia.
Like Soros in Europe and Scaife in the US, the Asia Foundation provided money through scholarships and fellowship programs for Asian scholars and American scholars in Asia, particularly for anthropologists, meanwhile documenting personal information from all parties involved. This went on for decades until a 1967 New York Times article revealed that the foundation was receiving indirect funds from the CIA. The CIA had been developing personal relationships with academics within the American Anthropologists Association program that disbanded after the New York Times article. These contacts were involved in a wide range of activities, such as foreign espionage and recruitment of CIA operatives. One of these 1982 memos is from William Schneider, Jr. of the Office of Management and Budget to Deputy National Security Advisor Robert McFarland, referencing the budget, which had just been cut for the Asia Foundation, but was later reconsidered.
I now understand that a proposal to continue U.S. funding for the Asia Foundation is included in the political action initiatives being developed by the State Department and several other agencies.
The change of heart likely due to Walter Raymond.
The Department of State underscored that the Asia Foundation had made significant contributions to U.S. foreign policies through fostering democratic institutions and, as a private organization, had accomplished things which a government organization cannot do.
By the time of the Reagan administration, the 1984 fiscal funding for the Asia Foundation would be directed through USIA, or U.S. Information Agency budget, a group which was funding dozens of Reagan's democracy initiatives.
It is essential the state maintain its operational and management role with the Asia Foundation.
In the 2016 annual report for the Asia Foundation, it is stated that the foundation is funded by an annual appropriation from the U.S. Congress, competitively bids awards from governmental and multilateral development agencies, including the U.S. Agency for International Development, Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, United Kingdom's Department for International Development, and by private foundations and corporations. $94.5 million now coming from multiple countries and intelligence agencies. Freedom House was included in these memos, and like the Asia Foundation, advertised itself as a human rights organization. Since its inception, the NED has given out hundreds of millions of dollars to NGOs around the world. Media outlets, activist groups, and political candidates, all on the receiving end of the NED and its subsidiaries, such as the 2014 coup of elected Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. In 2012, the Russian parliament passed legislation requiring recipients of foreign political funds to register within the government, similar to FARA. Both the NED and Freedom House opposed the law, saying the Duma would restrict human rights and the activities of civil society organizations and their ability to receive support from abroad. Changes to Russia's NGO legislation will soon require civil society organizations receiving foreign funds to choose between registering as foreign agents or facing significant financial penalties and potential criminal charges. Gershman and the NED were stoking the fires of hostility between Russia and Ukraine. In 2013, Gershman said,
Ukraine's choice to join Europe will accelerate the demise of the ideology of Russian imperialism that Putin represents.
This covertly funded meddling has long set the stage for the current situation in Ukraine and the Russiagate allegations, leaked emails that hampered Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Outwardly, the Asia Foundation appears to be a long-standing nonprofit dedicated to the developments in Asia, donating books and empowering women in the region. But the reality is that it was a CIA creation since 1951, used as a propaganda vehicle and front for covert psychological operations. These revelations come from declassified CIA documents in reference to DT Pillar, the acronym for the Committee for a Free Asia, later known as the Asia Foundation. To this day, false information regarding the Foundation's role in overseas intelligence gathering is promoted on the group's own website, which states its inception date from 1954, but project outlines show clearly that DT Pillar was created and receiving covert funding since 1951, along with various NGOs, associations, and universities. Displayed here is the redacted name of the foreign branch chief, later known to be George H. Green. The CFA's role was to create groups to fight communism, and assisting the Office of Policy Coordination, the Psychological Warfare Division of the CIA. Any officials associated and receiving funds should be placed on a covert contract basis with CIA. By 1953, the Asia Foundation was able to provide cover to such groups covertly established to lend propaganda support to major Far East projects, which aim at the development of guerrilla and popular political resistance movements. The CIA's desire to keep a lid on all of the Asia Foundation's activities even reached to the FBI, instructing them not to investigate any operations of DT Pillar. After the term of President George Green, the agency appointed Jewish CIA agent Robert Bloom. He had served as a chief for an ECA mission to Asia. Later that month, a memo states that the agency's objective was for the CFA to act as an instrument of psychological warfare and a vehicle for covert operations. The CFA's main objective was clearly stated in their priorities: developing leaders who were friendly to the United States. Other PSYOP programs would follow and transfer to programs under the CFA, always involving the recruitment of covert operatives. One program in particular focused on the destabilization of the Soviets, a project known as QK Active, operating under a similarly named American Committee for the Liberation of the People of the USSR, using methods such as Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe and the Institute for the Study of the USSR, led by Jewish social activist Stanislav Stankiewicz. DT Pillar was operating all throughout Asia and was fully operational in Cambodia, even after the withdrawal of American citizens in the 1960s. An entire team of agents staying behind, bolstering propaganda, training militia, implementing PSYOPs, recruiting and passing intelligence to the CIA and State Department. None of this was publicly known until years later, despite multiple accusations from Asian governments. In a 1966 Washington Post article, the former communist Cambodian king and prime minister of Cambodia, Norodom Sihanouk, accuses the Asia Foundation of staying behind in Cambodia and operating despite the will of the government and the people. It wasn't until the Katzenbach Commission would suggest removing the Asia Foundation and other private organizations from CIA funding that the Asia Foundation attempted to cover their financial tracks, using Radio Free Asia and Radio Liberty as created entities for support. In came Henry Kissinger for assistance in receiving more funding by 1969. Since then, the Asia Foundation has attempted to distance themselves from their CIA ties by skewing information on their website and progress reports, stating that it receives almost half of their support from private entities. But their own filings show that more than 85% of its funding comes from governmental support. At the Foundation's helm, Robert Bloom, a name many would hardly recognize. But Bloom's impact on American foreign policy and intelligence gathering is enormous. Very little is published for a man who's held multiple influential positions. Bloom had been assistant to Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, assistant deputy for economic affairs during the Eisenhower administration. He was a decorated soldier, earning the Croix de Guerre and the U.S. Medal of Freedom, the highest award given to civilians by the President of the United States. For an individual to be held in such esteem, why do we know so little about Robert Bloom? There is not even a Wikipedia entry for the man who served as first president of a foundation that has been established well over 50 years. Following the 1952 presidential election, President Dwight Eisenhower created the President's Committee on International Information Activities, otherwise known as the Jackson Committee. The resulting Jackson Report would outline a series of propaganda initiatives for years to come. Bloom was an instrumental part of this result. In a correspondence with then CIA Director Alan Dulles, Bloom is preparing for a series of questions to be presented in a meeting between the CIA and the President's committee. His question:
Is psychological warfare a technique in its own right, or an illusion that risks distorting the proper conception of foreign policy as a whole?
The objective was simple: to win the Cold War, and for American propaganda to be narrowed down to simple phrases that were to be constantly repeated. These ideals and phrases might often be implemented in college textbooks, used abroad, published by the Asia Foundation. During Bloom's time at the ECA in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, Bloom appeared to be on the verge of Francophobia, which prompted French General Jean Delort to call for his removal from his post and calling him the most dangerous man in Indochina. Bloom was transferred to Indonesia in 1951, at a time when U.S. aid to Indonesia was to be scaled down. Once again, Bloom called for continued aid, warning that communist factions would see the dwindling aid as a sign of failed support. In a 1956 edition of Pacific Affairs, Bloom is to have said that the Asian Foundation helped Asians adapt Western knowledge, warning of the impending dangers of communism. The Asia Foundation was actively involved in the film industry as well. Their first sponsored film, Ludo Ong Tan, or The People Win Through, premiered in 1953, produced in Burma, based on a play written by the first Prime Minister of Burma, nationalist U Nu. The Asia Foundation helped finance the film through Cascade Pictures, working as a liaison for the Asia Foundation. In charge was Charles M. Tanner, founder and director of Christian mission-based theater company Covenant Players, and writer for the hit American TV show Bonanza. Asian cinema historian Professor Sang-Joon Lee cites in his article titled The Asia Foundation's Motion Picture Project and the Cultural Cold War in Asia that a meeting occurred on the 17th of December 1953 between Tanner, Italian film director Frank Capra, and head of Paramount Pictures Foreign and Domestic Censorship Luigi Lurashi. This meeting was to drum up support for the Southeast Asian Film Festival, an annual event sponsored by the Federation of Motion Picture Producers in Southeast Asia. This was to take place in Tokyo in May of 1954. Tanner had already gotten backing from American film producer Cecil B. DeMille, president of Republic Pictures Herbert Yates, the man who launched the careers of Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, and John Wayne. The meeting was moderated by CIA agent Carlton W. Alsop, brother of newspaper journalist and CIA agent Joseph Alsop, who was working undercover for Paramount Pictures. Their brother Stuart, also a journalist. Their father, American politician Joseph Wright Alsop IV. All of them came from the influential Alsop family, which included Republican Governor of New York, John A. King. Carlton had been the contact for American intelligence officer E. Howard Hunt in obtaining the rights to George Orwell's Animal Farm cartoon film, along with American film writer Phineas Farr, believed to be Luigi Lurashi. Capra represented the U.S. at a previous festival in India in 1952 and was eager to influence the Japanese industry to promote anti-communist material. Capra's first sound film, The Younger Generation, was a comedy about a Jewish family in New York City. He quickly became Columbia Pictures' most trusted director under Jewish co-founder and president Harry Cohn. Luigi Lurashi, who reportedly wrote under the name Owen, often corresponded with the CIA. He made sure that Paramount content, in particular war content, was not to be disturbing for Jews overseas. He censored bits of the 1944 film The Hitler Gang, citing multiple anti-Semitic statements. He encouraged the idea of more positive roles for Black Americans to counter the foreign propaganda. Details of Lurashi's involvement are still unclear. Whether he was genuinely working for nationalist purposes or acting on behalf of the CIA is difficult to determine, but Lurashi, Capra, and DeMille's activities aligned with the Asia Foundation under the leadership of Robert Bloom. Producers and directors from Burma, Hong Kong, South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand were now getting support from the Asia Foundation to orient the Federation towards the West instead of the East. By 1955, the Asia Foundation had offices in Tokyo, Taipei, Manila, Hong Kong, Karachi, Kuala Lumpur, Rangoon, Dhaka, Colombo, Bangkok, Seoul, and Kabul. Most agents were university professors and journalists. Board members were film executives, writers, and educators. Historian Tony Judt estimates that by 1953, the Asia Foundation had cost Americans $127 million. The radio broadcast, Voices of Asia, had emerged as a new front, focused on targeting political and young intellectual minds. But with Bloom's arrival, all of this would come under the Asia Foundation, an allegiance of anti-communist filmmakers. What the Foundation and the CIA later discovered was that Asia itself was not ready to define Asia, much less unite. Political instability, currency regulations, and equipment shortages, just some of the many reasons this project would struggle. Robert Bloom helped create the Armed Forces Security Agency, which later became the NSA. He set the stage for the Vietnam War and reshaped the way U.S. and foreign intelligence operates to this day, all while remaining relatively unknown. Bloom died as he was working on his final manuscript for the U.S. and China in World Affairs, a multi-book project for the Council of Foreign Relations. The project was not released until the Kennedy administration.
There is always a question whether a democratic country is capable of having an intelligence service of any great merit, simply because of the built-in inhibitions. It usually takes a national crisis or a Pearl Harbor where people then understand what survival means. But you don't have to be a great or large or wealthy country to have a good intelligence service. As long as you have the norms, as long as you have the disciplines, as long as you have the motivation, the singleness of purpose, you can be a small service, have one great penetration, and you can move the world.
Why do we need intelligence at all?
For survival. Fundamentally for survival.
Have you any regrets about going?
Under the circumstances, I have no regrets. But I regret not being in CIA.
You miss it?
Totally.
Whether it was the Jewish-led KGB and their leftist army of largely Jewish Soviet spies, journalists, and scientists, or the right-leaning neoconservative nationalists, one loyalty that appeared to remain constant was that to the State of Israel and Zionism. Since the World Wars, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel has developed at an alarming rate. An early architect of this intelligence and counterintelligence sharing relationship was American operative James Jesus Angleton, one-time chief of counterintelligence for the CIA. Angleton oversaw a group of communist informants known as the Lovestone Empire, after former Communist Party leader, Lithuanian Jewish activist Jay Lovestone, who, like so many others, somehow found a change of political heart and were now using covert funds to organize anti-communist unions. One of these men that Angleton tracked, U.S. Marine veteran Lee Harvey Oswald. Angleton appears to have obstructed the efforts to investigate Oswald, and much of his Senate testimony regarding the matter remains classified to this day. He had been receiving reports on Oswald's movements for years, and at the time of John F. Kennedy's assassination, would have been well known to Angleton and senior officers. In July of 2023, declassified documents revealed the identity of another Lithuanian Jew involved in screening Oswald, Reuben Efron, a lieutenant colonel in the army, an immigrant from Lithuania. Efron had an extensive knowledge of Jewish spy tradition and had contributed writing to the Jewish Bible Quarterly, 3 pieces of which are part of a series, military intelligence in the Bible. These memos imply that high-level CIA agents were interested in even the most minute details of Oswald's life, over a year before Kennedy was killed.
This morning, a recent decision by President Biden concerning documents related to the JFK assassination is raising new questions about what the government knew and when. The president, late last month, issued a final order certifying documents from the JFK investigation to be released. But the New York Times reports 4,684 of the files remain either partially or fully withheld from the public's eye.
On June 30th, President Biden washed his hands of the JFK matter and said that this would be his last order about JFK.
Jefferson Morley is editor of the blog JFK Facts. He says some of the files being withheld could shed light on the CIA's investigation before JFK's death.
What remains is about 4,400 documents from a variety of federal agencies, primarily the CIA, that still contain some redactions ranging from a word to a paragraph to a page to the whole document.
Morley says there's one name that's been a mystery all these years and was made public in the files, Reuben Efron, who worked for the CIA and was intercepting Lee Harvey Oswald's mail in the months before the assassination.
Reuben Efron died 30 years ago. So they're not protecting the name of a living person. They're protecting the operational activity that he was engaged in, which was reading Lee Harvey Oswald's mail. What it shows is that the CIA was running some kind of intelligence operation, we don't know exactly what, around Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin, while President Kennedy was still alive.
The relationship between the Kennedys and the Jews is a complicated one. One of Kennedy's first acts in the Senate in February of 1953 was his sponsorship of a resolution condemning the persecution of Jews in the Soviet Union. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was perceived by many Jews as an anti-Semite for his opposition to the Second World War. He welcomed Hitler's ideas as a proper solution to world problems, but warned of the Jew media.
Jewish pundits in New York and Los Angeles were ready to set a match to the fuse of the world.
He also told a British reporter that the democratic policy of the United States is a Jewish production. But John Kennedy would prove to be less problematic for the Jews. He had planned to create a public conference in Washington with prominent leaders of Jewish organizations to appeal to the public's sympathy for the plight of Russian Jewry. But the one issue he did have may have been the crucial link in discovering the reason for the president's demise. In 1963, President John Kennedy warned Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol that relations between the U.S. and Israel would be seriously jeopardized if Israel would not agree to regular U.S. inspections of Israel's nuclear reactor.
As I wrote Mr. Ben-Gurion, this government's commitment to and support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized if it should be thought that we were unable to obtain reliable information on a subject as vital to peace as Israel's effort in the nuclear field.
Kennedy was not bluffing with Israel. He knew that the Soviets could use the knowledge of Israel's burgeoning program as a reason to increase their own presence in the Middle East. 7 weeks later, Eshkol would submit. According to a report from the Foreign Ministry of Israel, Kennedy had surprised the Deputy Defense Minister, Shimon Peres, during a meeting Peres had scheduled with Kennedy's advisor, Ukrainian-born Jewish-American lawyer Meyer Feldman. The president pressed Peres personally on the topic, to which Peres replied,
I can tell you most clearly that we will not introduce nuclear weapons to the region, and certainly we will not be the first.
Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
James Angleton was holding secrets that would have likely led to the specific reasons for Kennedy's assassination, and perhaps much of it centered around Angleton's desire to keep even his own intelligence community from discovering how Israel was acquiring nuclear weapons in the first place. For a non-Jew, Angleton was fierce in his loyalty to Israel, although his mother was a suspected Sephardic crypto-Jew.
Angleton's loyalty to Israel betrayed U.S. policy on an epic scale. He was a friend you could trust on a personal basis. He was the biggest Zionist of the lot.
Angleton was one of the founders of the CIA in 1947. 2 years later, he would become head of staff of the Office of Special Operations, and a few years later, worked as liaison with Israeli Mossad and Shin Bet. There he worked closely with future heads of MI6, Kim Philby, part of the Cambridge 5 spy ring that divulged British information to the Soviets during World War II. Philby's wife, Hungarian Jew Litzy Friedman, or Alice Coleman, was an active communist. Philby was expelled from Washington after being discovered as a Soviet mole, based on the decoded communications in the Venona project. He later emerged as a general in the KGB. Angleton didn't particularly care for Jewish business practice, but was fascinated with the land of Israel and saw it as a perfect location to cultivate spies from Eastern Europe. In the early 1960s, 2 KGB defectors came to the West to offer their services to the CIA, Anatoly Golitsyn and Yuri Nosenko. Golitsyn convinced Angleton that Nosenko was a double agent sent by the KGB. Angleton canceled Nosenko's deal and held him at a black site facility in Maryland, where he was kept for the next 4 years and allegedly dosed with LSD. Nosenko was eventually released without ever being proven to have been a mole. Philby's betrayal had caused Angleton to believe more moles existed. His suspicions were correct. Soviet intelligence officer Peter Popov went missing after having passed secrets to American officials. Soon after that came the arrest of Oleg Penkovsky, who had been spying for the British. Golitsyn claimed that the Soviets wanted to convince the West that the long-time alliance between the Soviet Union and China was beginning to show cracks. Angleton was convinced, but appeared to be wrong about Nosenko and his mole hunt, which would lead to an eventual lack of support from his own peers. With the arrival of director William Colby in 1973, Angleton's resignation to the CIA and quiet rehiring would come years later.
Admiration for the Jewish state became an obsession with Angleton, who fell captive to the magic of Israeli intelligence.
Where there was disillusionment with the Soviets, there was clarity with Israel. It was Israeli spy chief and former Haganah arms dealer Teddy Kollek who tipped off Angleton on Kim Philby. But it was Angleton's willingness to look the other way when enriched uranium was making its way from Pennsylvania to Israel. From 1965 to 1980, the FBI investigated Jewish-American chemist Zalman Shapiro, company president, who also happened to be the former president of the Pittsburgh chapter of the Zionist Organization of America. The plant itself was purchased by Zionists. Between the years of 1959 to 1968, 267 kilograms of uranium went missing at the Numek plant. At the same time, Israel was constructing a plant in the Negev desert town of Dimona. While Angleton may not have been directly involved, he had to have known about it. He was aware of Mossad spy Rafi Eitan and his visit to the compound, as well as Eitan's connection with convicted spy Jonathan Pollard, who just so happened to have been an early housemate of Mira Lansky-Boland of the ADL. The Department of Energy struggled with their investigation, thanks to an uncooperative CIA and NUMEC President Shapiro, and Congress seemed unwilling to investigate further. Despite Angleton's scope of knowledge on NUMEC, he was certain that Israel was building a bomb and did nothing about it. What he was doing was meeting regularly with Itzhak Rabin and Mossad chiefs Amit and Ephraim Halevi, as often as 5 times a week. In 1974, CIA Director William Colby fired Angleton after a mass surveillance program was revealed by the New York Times. The operation, known as Chaos, targeted anti-war protesters and those deemed as dissidents and black nationalists.
Angleton's most significant and enduring legacy was to legitimize mass surveillance of Americans.
Angleton's firing came 4 months after President Richard Nixon's resignation, which was another embarrassment for him. His denouncement of the Watergate situation prompted Congress to investigate the CIA, uncovering multiple abuses, from mail opening, speak of assassinations, new organization infiltration, and even the mind control efforts of MKUltra. But the early efforts of chaos was initiated under President Lyndon Johnson, a man who was even more friendly to the young state of Israel. The Kennedys and the Johnsons were not exactly fond of each other, and according to Kennedy's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, Johnson had some sort of information to blackmail Kennedy in order to convince him to put Johnson on the VP ticket instead of his first choice, Senator Stuart Symington. Rumors of wild parties, orgies, and infidelity have gone around for years, but it likely came from FBI director and neighbor of Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover. Jewish law allows for Lyndon Johnson to be considered Jewish by way of his maternal grandparents, a fact that would please his Jewish supporters and Israel. In the coming years, the United States became Israel's chief diplomatic ally and primary arms supplier. As a congressman in 1938 and 39, Johnson arranged visas for Jews in Warsaw and allowed for the illegal immigration of Jews through Galveston, Texas. His Aunt Jessie Johnson Hatcher was a member of the Zionist Organization of America. His grandfather and father lent support to Leo Frank, a Jewish factory superintendent who was convicted in 1913 of raping and killing a 13-year-old employee, Mary Fagan. The defense of Leo Frank came from wealthy American Jews and Freemasons of the B'nai B'rith, later known as the Anti-Defamation League. The murder was supposedly a blood libel ritual, the trial a major media spectacle, and the stunning decision to commute Frank's sentence led to an outraged public. On the afternoon of August 16, 1915, 8 cars broke into Milledgeville State Penitentiary and abducted Leo Frank. Frank was hanged at 7 a.m., facing the direction of Fagan's home. Because of the Johnsons' support for Frank, the KKK had threatened to burn their home. Lyndon Johnson often referenced Frank's lynching as a symptom of anti-Semitism. Less than a week after taking office, President LBJ sponsored a bill that would naturalize Polish and Lithuanian Jews. He publicly offered residency to Jewish Austrian conductor Erich Leinsdorf. In addition to flooding Texas with illegal Jewish nationals, he helped sell war bonds to raise funds for underground Jewish militants in Palestine, using crates marked as Texas grapefruit. Soon after, tanks and fighter jets would be approved for sale to Israel. Just 1 month after succeeding the slain JFK, LBJ attended the dedication of the Agudas Hakim Synagogue in Austin, Texas.
We can't thank him enough for all those Jews he got out of Germany during the days of Hitler.
Johnson was well connected with another familiar character, Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky. Lansky's associate, New Orleans mobster Carlos Marcello, was sending money Johnson's way during his time as senator in exchange for helping ease legislation that might be convenient for organized crime. Lansky's other associate, Jewish mobster Benjamin Siegelbaum, or Bugsy Siegel, had invested with Johnson associate Bobby Baker in the purchase of a bank and vending machine company. With Kennedy now out of the picture and LBJ in control, U.S. Middle East policy would now shift towards a positive view on Israel. The U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia could move forward and would empower Israel, the ADL, the CIA, and Lansky's organized crime factions to flourish throughout Asia, trafficking narcotics. $17 billion of U.S. aid to Israel since 1946, 99% of it since 1965. But perhaps Lyndon Johnson's greatest show of loyalty towards Israel came again at America's expense. June 8, 1967, Israeli jet fighters and torpedo boats bombed, torpedo-gunned, and even napalmed the USS Liberty in international waters near the Sinai Peninsula. It occurred on the 4th day of the 6-day war between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, when Israel seized the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. The destruction killed 34 crew members and injured 171. According to the testimony of former Strategic Air Command B-52 pilot Jim Nanjo, his unit in San Diego, California was placed on high alert just before the attack. This alert could have only come from one man, President Lyndon Johnson. Israel offered an apology, claiming mistaken identity, but many believed it to be a deliberate plan, devised to place blame on the Egyptians and justify U.S. intervention. Israeli politician Moshe Dayan admitted in a letter to his daughter released after death that most incidents were created by Israeli provocation, at least 80%. Official records state that 3 Mirage fighter jets were unmarked. The Liberty's communications were jammed, as was the international distress frequency, which is damning to Israel's claim of mistaken identity. Lyndon Johnson's first action upon hearing of the incident was to have his secretary compile information regarding a plan for his re-election campaign. By 10 a.m., an order to keep the press from photographing the event went out. Johnson did not want public opinion to sour on Israel.
President Lyndon Johnson came out with a comment that he didn't give a damn if the ship sank. He would not embarrass his allies.
Lyndon Johnson most likely orchestrated the murder of JFK, the USS Liberty attack, and could have possibly brought the U.S. into a third world war once again on behalf of the international Jewish interest. The man he assigned to shape the narrative? Admiral John S. McCain, father of U.S. Senator John McCain.
Admiral McCain, the senator's dad.
Yeah.
And I know he had orders, just like we had orders. You don't got to talk about this. He was supposed to find it was an accident. Israel said it was an accident, so it's an accident. The only thing that made me mad is when he wrote the cover letter for the thing. But in his cover letter back to D.C., Chief of Naval Operations, he took a paragraph and kind of congratulated Israel for the efficiency of the attack and how accurate and penetrating their weapons were. And I didn't get that till years later. But when I saw that, why in the world would a Navy admiral
Commend the people who attacked you.
And I don't care what John McCain says, the senator. Sir, if you ever see this, your dad was a coward because he lied. He got bought and paid off. Period. That's the way I feel.
This international Jewish interest has only grown since these events. Operations like Chaos have grown under Reagan, Bush, and a growing intelligence apparatus. Soon the country would experience these brutal effects of yet another international Jewish interest, a project known as MK Ultra.